thank you very much, and I'm particularly humbled and honoured to have the family here to listen to this lecture today. Today, the phrase exchanging words has a double meaning. At one level, it's a simple synonym for the act of conversing with another person, describing a brief episode of communication between two interlocutors. It usually implies haste and indicates a degree of polite formality. In such situations, people typically exchange conventional greetings or superficial pleasantries. At another level, the phrase is a euphemism for an interaction of a more heated and hostile kind. It recollects an incident that was painful or embarrassing. To exchange words means to argue or quarrel, frequently in an angry or agitated fashion. It denotes a verbal confrontation that stops short of violence, but which can all too easily trigger it. Exchanging words is sometimes a prelude to exchanging bodily blows. Carrying connotations of both sociability and enmity, the phrase captures the fundamental ambivalence of speech in the sphere of social relations. As we saw yesterday, telling the truth was a similarly complex concept in the early modern period. It signalled the interlinked Christian duties of charitably reproving one's brethren and neighbours, openly confessing one's faith, and proclaiming the message of the gospel to heretics and unbelievers. Its opposite was the sinful silence of dissimulation and equivocation. This lecture uses the phrase exchanging words as a framework for exploring further features of the linguistic contours of religious coexistence in early modern England. It considers how speech was used as a weapon in everyday encounters between people of different faiths, as well as its role as a tool for achieving conciliation and concord. It probes the practices of nicknaming and defamation, alongside the ways in which public disputations and dialogues were deployed as an aid to restoring unity. As before, I pay as much attention to the tone and style of these exchanges as to their ideological content. We begin by returning to the theme of the persecution of the tongue. Alongside the injuries inflicted by hands and swords were those caused by hurtful words. Many invoke this phrase to describe the reviling of the apostles and the primitive Christians, and by extension applied it to their own experiences. It was a commonplace that God sent such tribulations to test the faithful, who had a duty to endure them patiently and meekly. The children of the Lord could never expect to be free of the persecution of the tongue, whatever form it took. Threatenings, aspersings, defamations, detractions, censurings, uncharitable rash judgings, mockings and deridings. The recipients of fraternal correction and frank speaking all too frequently saw themselves as the victims of unwarrantable oppression and malicious harassment. In a treatise against the admonition to Parliament in 1571, John Whitgift denounced the spiteful language that the Elizabethan Puritans levelled against upstanding members of the Church of England, no less than papists and atheists, saying that though bloodshed was thankfully ceasing, the persecution of the tongue was still extreme hot. Others complained about the harsh treatment meted out to them by the episcopal establishment. In the 17th century, Presbyterians and other dissenters not only accused conformists of engaging in it against the self-styled saints, but levelled the same charge against their sectarian rivals. In 1646, John Lay, a member of the Westminster Assembly, said that the Independents were as guilty of the persecution of the tongue and pen as the rest. Never was there any so sharp and bitter as theirs. In 1655, William Gurnall wondered whether ministers of the gospel had ever suffered a hotter persecution of the tongue than in this apostatizing age. In 1676, the Baptist preacher Thomas Collier complained that evil speakings were the currency even of those who pretend to be against persecution. By the late 17th century, the debate about the legitimacy of religious coexistence had evolved in new directions, but the problem of provocative language had not disappeared. Everyone agreed that the correct response to verbal victimization was to turn the other cheek and to suffer in dignified silence. Contemporary sense of the close affinity between linguistic and physical violence was cemented in martyrological texts, which themselves illustrate the conditions in which hateful speech was perceived to flourish. John Fox's Acts and Monuments recorded the vicious taunts directed against those convicted of heresy during the reign of Mary I and their providential punishments. These included the sheriff's servant who mocked the Suffolk martyr James Abbes as a mad heretic as he was led to his execution, and was subsequently struck with a frenzy by the vengeful hand of God. When Thomas Bennet went to the stake in 1532, one man shouted, "Ah, whoreson heretic, pray to Our Lady and say Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis, or by God's wounds I will make thee do it." Narratives of the deaths of Catholic missionary priests under Elizabeth I likewise underline the audible animosity of the crowd. They tell of spectators who cried, "A devil, a devil," when Father Richard Simon was found to be wearing a hair shirt, and who made catcalls when John Nelson began reciting Latin prayers to prepare himself for death. People cried "Fie" on the obstinate traitor when Eustace White kissed the rope that would strangle him. By contrast, those who watched Edward Morgan die at Tyburn in 1642 seemed to incline more to compassion than to offer any affront or uncivil words. The hostility and the sympathy of the multitude were both standard martyrological motifs. The intemperate speeches that were regularly directed against those put to death for their faith provided their followers with proof of their status as martyrs. The Protestant victims of the Irish Rebellion were similarly attuned to the role of sound in the sectarian atrocities to which they were subjected. In 1641, Andrew Adair told the commissioners how Mr. Oliphant, a constant preaching minister from Scotland, was harangued by a great multitude, singing with deriding voices about him some of the psalms before he was hanged. His ordeal involved a raucous parody of the Protestant tradition of plainsong. In one episode, the rebels allegedly cut out the tongue of a 14-year-old girl that she might not tell of their cruelty, but she declared it by writing. Nothing could stop the truth coming out. Puritans also positively revelled in their tongue persecution, repeatedly complaining that they were made into a byword and a mocking stock. This paradoxically offered them assurance that they numbered among the elect. It was remembered of the pious Protestant matron, Elizabeth Juxon, that she was content to endure the hatred of the world for her profession's sake, to endure the persecution of the tongue and the taunts of carnal friends. The animosity levelled against Puritans was partly a function of their own unwillingness to consort and even converse with the profane and reprobate. Their enemies condemned the refusal of Puritans to speak to none that walk in the street. Their unfriendly and discourteous demeanour fostered resentments that found an outlet in violent speech. A further source of irritation was their propensity to chastise the ungodly and their proclivity for protracted prayers and prolonged sermons, which one contemporary disparaged as mere bibble-babble. Another was the biblical vocabulary and holy conversation that Puritans employed to differentiate themselves from those who spoke what Robert Bolton called the language of hell. No less irritating to those who resented them were the unusual names they gave to their children: flee sin, praise God, much mercy, and so on. When in 1599 a Devonshire vicar refused to christen the infant son of a schoolmaster Dewell and called it John instead, this caused a great murmuring among the Anabaptistical and precise brethren. The frictions that arose between Puritans and their neighbours were rooted in a tissue of words. They reflected the steady development of diverging speech and linguistic communities. This was vital in shaping the self-perception of other groups too. During and after the Civil War, allegations of verbal abuse were frequently made by ministers who supported the Royalist cause. On New Year's Day, 1643, for instance, the Gloucestershire parson Henry Fowler was arrested by rebel soldiers who reportedly not only took him by the throat, held a sword to his breast, shook an axe over his head and barbarously treated him, but also assaulted him by the tongue, calling him mass priest, rogue and rascal. The experiences of the radical sects were frequently described in the same terms. John Bunyan encapsulated the trials of the Baptists in a key scene in the Pilgrim's Progress. As they pass through Vanity Fair, Christian and faithful find themselves the victims of verbal and physical abuse. Their strange clothes, demeanour, and forms of expression expose them to derision as fools and bedlams by worldly men and women who do not speak the language of Canaan. The books of sufferings compiled by the Quakers also recorded their persecutions of the tongue. These sharpened their sense of redemptive victimhood. Preaching in Lancashire in 1652, George Fox met with a multitude of abuses from the ignorant people, animated by designing priests. He endured insults, beatings, stonings, kickings, railings, revilings, and contradictions of sinners with Christian patience and magnanimity. Crowds resented the aggressive proselytizing of female friends like Deborah Herding, crying, "Kill her and tear her to pieces." The rude people who were the Quakers' enemies hurled abuse at them, as well as sticks and stones. At Mitcham in Surrey, parishioners made rough music with kettles and drums, as well as throwing eggs. Others drowned out a silent meeting in Cambridge in July 1660 by making hideous noises of their own in a kind of acoustic war. In reverse, mainstream Protestants turned upon the Friends, condemning them as the real tongue persecutors. In 1653, Francis Higginson denounced the violent, uncivil and immoderate speech the Quakers used to shock people into seeing the light and converting to the faith of Christ. Their rejection of standard terms of honour and deference to social superiors and their use of the levelling pronouns thee and thou stirred up hatred, hostility and fear. This levelling language undermined the hierarchies of social deference. The Quakers' assault on established civilities and their insistence on plain speaking brought them into conflict with other people. In tandem with the distinctive idioms that characterised their own modes of speaking within the sect, the harsh words levelled against them were key ingredients in forging their identity. Language differentiated the Friends from the corrupt worldlings who surrounded them. Next, we must turn to the potency and power of nicknames in early modern England. Recent developments in onomastics and the anthropology of naming have fostered renewed interest in the role that labels of all kinds play in both binding communities and tearing them apart. Stigmatizing other people with derogatory terms cements the construction of negative stereotypes. Like the language of sorts described by Keith Wrightson, the religious nicknames that proliferated in post-Reformation England and Europe expressed and entrenched evolving dichotomies at the same time. Pregnant with conflict, they exacerbated existing enmities and promoted new ones. These polemical epithets are indicative of intricately transactional patterns of identity formation that deserve close attention. The terms Lollard, Protestant, Papist, Puritan, Quaker and Ranter were at first utilised sarcastically to sting and to wound. They did not originate as legal categories. Only slowly did these pejoratives become forms of self-designation embraced as badges of honour. Protestant was initially a calculated insult against the upstart heretics by the self-proclaimed Catholics, which carried clear theological baggage. Puritan had similar roots. It was said that Alexandra was the first deviser of this word of doubtful signification, and other leading recusant writers deployed it with equal acidity. But figures within the ranks of the Church of England, like Richard Bancroft, took it up in the 1590s and made it their own. Papist was similarly utilised to prosecute internal Protestant quarrels. Each side in the emerging divide between conformists and Puritans castigated the other as bastard or crafty papists, in other words, as Catholics in disguise. Some nicknames made direct reference to styles of speech and gesture. Applied to the followers of Wycliffe, the term lollard is linked with the word loll, which means to thrust out one's tongue in a pendulous manner. This was a practice associated with the idle and fools. Quaker is an allusion to the propensity of those who called themselves friends to tremble or quake with religious fervour. Fervent Protestants were occasionally dismissed as prattling stants. The first part of this punning compound defines the practice of talking in a childish, incomprehensible, or inconsequential way. It's also a synonym for chatter and gossip. More broadly, early evangelicals like John Bale linked popery with disordered, indistinct, and uncivil speaking, with the mumbling and muttering of those who prayed in Latin and the cursing and swearing that marked out the seditious. Anticipating Patrick Collinson's compelling remark that the word Puritan was one half of a stressful relationship, contemporaries understood that derogatory labels promoted the very polarities they purported to describe. Puritans constantly complained that they were branded with this odious nickname and its synonym precisian to bring the very truth of religion and the power of godliness into contempt. The future Presbyterian Richard Baxter recalled how he and his family were slurred with this term by their fellow inhabitants and the vulgar rabble of Kidderminster, who were irked by their ardent piety and God-fearing lifestyle. Over time, the godly applied the term to themselves and wore it with pride. The consequence of this reflexive process was a shift in what Alex Shepard has called the calculus of esteem. Just as the language of self-description employed by ordinary men and women who acted as witnesses offers insight into the reconfiguration of the relationship between wealth and status in the 16th and 17th centuries, so too do religious nicknames reveal the changing coordinates of social orientation. The binary language of religious insult became increasingly fragmented in the 1640s and 50s. In vindicating the cause of those nicknamed Quakers, George Bateman listed a teeming array of old and new terms that were circulating during these decades: Papist, Prelesian, Presbyterian, Independent, Anabaptist, Familist, Brownist, Arian, Atheist, Free Willer, Free Gracian, Ranter, Sadducee, Libertine, etc. He confessed that corporal punishment upon the bodies of men was much abated, but the second persecution or killing via the tongue was still in as full force and vigour as ever. As reflected in these title pages and broadsides, the evolution of new taxonomic labels was symptomatic of a situation in which pluralism could no longer be eradicated. Intriguingly, some of these were noisy enthusiasts, and others were taciturn spiritualists known as silents. The heresiographies of Thomas Edwards, Daniel Featley, and Ephraim Paget were designed to suppress the dangerous tenets of these false prophets, to demonstrate the evils of toleration, and to encourage Parliament to introduce measures to prevent the spread of heresy. Ironically, they did the opposite. Name-calling not only helped to bring ephemeral networks and virtual communities of fellow believers into being as social phenomena, it also assisted in inventing sects such as the Ranters. It contributed to building solidarities that would eventually crystallise into what we now call denominations. As Anne Hughes remarks in her study of Thomas Edwards' Gangrena, the labels, categories, and stereotypes used to demonise outsiders shape how the world is understood and experienced. They interact in a complex way with stigmatised groups' self-images in processes of identity formation. If terminology sometimes lags behind reality, its parallel capacity to create it must not be underestimated. The growing utilisation of polemical labels to attack enemies within one's own ranks destabilise them as a means of demarcating truth from falsehood. In this context, we should speak less of one half of a stressful relationship than of a multi-sided prism fraught with tensions coming from several different directions. Such terms entered into the lexicon and became part of the inherited vocabulary of successive generations, as foreign phrase books and bilingual dictionaries evidence. In 1685, Guy Mige presented a list of religious nomenclature used in England in a text intended for French immigrants who'd fled their homeland in the wake of Louis XIV's revocation of the Edict of Nantes. This included Anglican, Presbyterian, Calvinist, Independent, Fifth Monarchist, Quaker, Anabaptist, and Fanatic. The absorption of these pejorative words into the realm of mundane conversation and child's play is no less revealing. In London, in the 1650s, young adolescents scoffed at playmates with Catholic parents, chanting the rhyme, "Papist, papist, pray to the Pope, your neck in a halter, your heels in a rope." In later Stuart Yorkshire, a poor recusant woman was derided and mocked as a papist by hissing boys when she was set in the marketplace stocks. Too old to be sent to prison, according to the Catholic who reported this incident, she was made into a monster or an owl in the daytime. If the words themselves lost some of their original venom, there continued to be circumstances in which they were used aggressively. Tone and bodily demeanour could turn otherwise unexceptional speech into violent insult. Undermining mutual trust, they retained their capacity to tip communities from relative harmony back into intolerance and violence. As we saw in Lecture 1, from the early Reformation onwards, attempts were made to ban the use of insulting labels. Henry VIII, Mary, and Elizabeth all sought to suppress contumelious and opprobrious terms as inimical to the project of restoring religious concord. In 1626, the Norfolk minister, John Yates, wished that a statute might be passed outlawing the offensive name of Puritan. For certainly, he said, Satan gains much by the free use of it. Efforts to repress derogatory speech were integral to maintaining charity and securing uniformity. It's intriguing that one of the mechanisms for abolishing diversity of opinions subsequently became a device for implementing toleration and granting freedom of conscience. It was in America rather than England that these calls first came to fruition. In 1649, the Catholic colony of Maryland passed a law banning a dazzling array of nicknames: heretic, schismatic, idolater, Puritan, independent, Presbyterian, popish priest, Jesuit, Jesuited papist, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anabaptist, Brownist, Antinomian, Barrowist, Roundhead, separatist, and any other term employed in a reproachful manner relating to matter of religion. Offenders were fined the sum of 10 shillings, or if they were too poor to pay, publicly whipped and imprisoned until they satisfied the parties they had grieved by openly asking them for forgiveness. The same applied to those who molested or discountenanced others in their religion, as long as they believed in Jesus Christ. This was driven by the conviction that the enforcing of the conscience of of matters of religion had frequently fallen out to be of dangerous consequence in those commonwealths where it hath been practised. Abstaining from deploying pejorative labels against fellow Christians was necessary to preserve mutual love and amity. But this edict did not extend to other faiths or to anti-Trinitarians. The Act balanced recognition of rival versions of Christian orthodoxy with constraints intended to preserve the peace. Sometimes described as America's first hate speech regulation, it articulates dilemmas that are still current today, albeit within narrower parameters. Drafted or amended by John Locke, the constitutions of Carolina of 1669 contain a similar clause prohibiting the use of reviling language against the religion of any church or profession, this being a certain way of disturbing the public peace. It also ran the risk of hindering the conversion of people to the truth by engaging them in quarrels and animosities to the hatred of the professors of that profession, which otherwise they might be brought to assent to. The silence for which this document legislated was designed to stop prejudice and disagreement for undermining stability. Simultaneously, it was a device for restoring religious unity. Locke still hoped that all would be brought into the ship of salvation. In 1647, the Kent preacher John Saltmarsh had also called for the names and notes of distinction taken up by way of scandal and reproach to be laid down and forborne. These were like standards and several colours in wars, and jeopardised the peaceful reconciliation of Protestant believers for which he called. More broadly, he urged these brethren to adopt a spirit of meekness, setting aside all passions, railings, and evil speaking, and to show tenderness in not offending each other in things indifferent. At the same time, Saltmarsh championed freedom of speech and debate in the pulpit and in print. The two were inextricably linked. Henry Robinson's 1644 plea for liberty of conscience commended the effects of the arrangements enshrined in the Edict of Nantes of 1598. In France, he observed, they are so temperate and discreet that it is held unseemly and uncivil part for a papist to ask another what religion he is of, whereas in England it is ordinary with Protestants to reproach one another with the nickname of Puritan or Separatist, Presbyterian or Independent. And when we cannot colourably fix any of these distinctions upon a man who differs from us in opinion or discourse only, we are so apt to term him malignant or popishly affected. Robinson's pamphlet saw liberty of conscience as the sole means to obtain peace and truth in the distracted times in which he lived. Its ultimate aim, though, was to ensure the freest passage of the gospel. Toleration would allow the true religion to triumph and wipe out its illegitimate rivals. As J.C. Davis has observed, the liberty for which Robinson and other tolerationists in the 1640s called was paradoxically the freedom to submit oneself wholly to God's will. This position on toleration was entirely compatible with the idea that the tongue should and could be tamed in the interests of Christian charity and state stability. It was consistent with a desire to cast reproachful language into oblivion in order to heal the bitter divisions fostered by the civil wars. Unrestrained speech was a danger, and self-imposed silence an ally to the project of reconciliation that preoccupied many during these years. The interpersonal conflicts that punctuate everyday life are all too often beyond the reach of historians. However, one body of material that preserves some of its evanescent traces are court records of suits for defamation and slander. In this way, some private exchanges entered into the public transcript. Levels of litigation for sins and crimes of the tongue were on the rise. The ecclesiastical and civil courts saw a surge of business of this kind between 1560 and 1730. Which disorderly speeches and transgressive utterances came under the jurisdiction of spiritual and secular justice was clear in theory, but increasingly blurred in practice as a consequence of the steady Erastian encroachment of the state into the sphere of religious deviance. A crucial difference was that the church courts could employ only spiritual sanctions. The plaintiff had the satisfaction of seeing the defendant shamed and compelled to make a penitential apology in front of the whole congregation. A suit for slander in the civil courts, by contrast, brought only financial recompense. For many, restoring their good name took priority over monetary reparation. Jim Sharp argued that the impulse to pursue the former route may be evidence less of a society filled with malice and hatred than of one in which the desire to resolve quarrels and restore charity remained imperative. To echo Ralph Holbrook, the burgeoning weeds of litigation did not altogether hide from view the ancient aim of reconciliation. More recent scholarship has re-emphasized the weaponization of the law by people determined to wreak revenge and trouble their neighbors. While cases in both civil and spiritual tribunals were on the increase, the spike was particularly pronounced in the ecclesiastical courts. Most were the result of action undertaken by individuals rather than by church officials. They reflected the pervasive concern with defending personal honour and credit that permeated English society. In the initial phases of the Reformation, there were defamation cases that centred upon allegations of religious deviance. Some individuals did take their neighbours to court for denouncing them as heretics. In 1526, a Leicestershire man called Thomas Hewitt sued his vicar, Robert Strange, for declaring that he was a heretic and a loller. 6 years later, Robert Ryquard accused a butcher of uttering the following scandalous, horrible and odious words against him at Petworth in Sussex, in a high voice and with the added edge of an accompanying oath: "Thou art an whoreson thief and a heretic." As a result, others now refused and omitted to converse with him. In Cornwall in 1548, the husbandman Richard Hoblen was prosecuted by Captain William Tredingt for questioning why another kept company with him, since he is the greatest heretic in the county, and we cannot abide the sight of him. Richard Hall took action against William Napper in 1551 for calling him an untrue subject to the king and a rank papist. The very fact that we begin to see heresy and popery cited as slanderous accusations in the early 16th century demonstrates the growing convergence of religious conformity and social respectability. Defending one's Protestant credentials became a social and political necessity. A case heard before the Northern High Commission in 1635 revolved around the scandalous words said by one Thomas Wall against Nicholas Carnes, who had once been a recusant papist and had now conformed himself. Wall called him a base turncoat. He was ordered to repent of his rash and unadvised speeches, which tended to the scandal of religion in Durham Cathedral. Here, the offence was impugning the motives of a Catholic who'd reconciled himself, at least outwardly, with the Church of England, and suggesting that he was an impious dissembler. Other episodes hint at the role of confessional tension in the micropolitics of the parish and household. When the stubbornly non-conforming Catholic spinster Catherine Meeborn abused the children of Thomas Hopper in the same year, calling them heretics and hell ratchets, they all being good Protestants, she was brought to the same court for contemptuous words. She denied this, but the testimony of witnesses confirmed that she had said angry and unbeseeming things in deliberate contempt of the Protestant religion, not only against, but in the hearing of the young. The social dynamics of such incidents are often opaque. They nevertheless attest to the spilling out of local conflicts into the domain of the law and their inflection by religious prejudice. Others were attempts to vindicate the professional honour of clergymen. In 1590, John Benson of Tamworth was prosecuted for saying that John Oldacres, the curate of Tamworth in Staffordshire, was a turncoat papist knave and an old whoremaster. No less provoking were the words of Dennis Holland of King's Sutton in Oxfordshire, who told her vicar to kiss her horse's tail. In Banbury in 1622, the churchwardens presented Thomas Gobbin, the elder, for charging our minister wrongfully with false doctrine and for reporting absolutely that he told a lie in the pulpit. It was said that he so lightly esteemed of him that he reported that he did not care a fart for him, which the cleric in question unsurprisingly took very unkindly. The vicar of Great Tay, Lionel Foster, meanwhile was denounced by one of his parishioners in 1591 as a minister of the devil, a bloodsucker, brawler, liar, knave, etc. The Catholic Christopher Walmsley's unreverent words against his vicar in 1635 included the slander that you are all stoned priests. He compounded his crime by waving a string of rosary beads and a crucifix in the streets in unbecoming manner and declaring he would continue to use them in despite of them. His body language reinforced the belligerent words that emerged from his mouth and undoubtedly helped to explain his indictment. The sensitivities that led to Anne Cotchett's prosecution for saying that the curate of Alveston had drunk 50, 40 or 30 healths together to the confusion of the Presbyterians in 1662 are difficult to fathom, but the recent ejection of dissenting ministers was evidently significant. The politics of religion often infiltrated the alehouse. Others reflected lay resentment of fraternal Christian rebuke. This helps to explain the tribulations of the Elizabethan minister John Elliston in Preston Capes, Northamptonshire, who claimed to have been molested by unjust complaints made out of malice to my office and person for reproving their superstition and wicked conversation. He alleged that his adversaries were vehemently suspected of popery and given to blasphemy, swearing, quarrelling, and prating and talking during service time. His sufferings at the hands of his parishioners were replicated by the scoffs and taunts to which he was subjected by Bishop Edmund Scambler of Peterborough, who apparently abused him as a pringcox and such like. In the Diocese of Canterbury in 1620, villagers similarly turned against their curate, Thomas Greenfield, for the many invective and spleenative sermons he preached to gall, touch, and personate such of his parishioners as he was offended at. The moral censoriousness of Puritan pastors often riled and enraged their parishioners, for whom it was evidence of their intrinsic hostility to settled traditions of good neighbourhood. Such incidents are indicative of a strand of popular anti-clericalism that was reanimated by the sacerdotalist pretensions of the Laudian clergy in the 1630s, whose high opinion of their office was connected with the doctrine of divine right episcopacy. The collapse of controls on speech in the 1640s further invigorated it and fed into attacks on scandalous and malignant priests. The vast majority of early modern defamation cases, however, concerned sexual slander. They turned on attempts to deflect the allegation that the plaintiff was guilty of adultery and fornication. The commonest words in dispute were whore, jade, queen, cuckold, pimp, and bawd. This was a gendered discourse that reflected women's anxieties about how they were perceived by their peers and the deleterious effects that such slights might have on their social standing. It also reflected the widespread assumption that women were prone to scolding, bickering, and unruly use of the tongue. As this 16th century satirical broadside entitled Tittle Tattle, describing the several branches of gossiping, reveals, gossip was conceived of as an archetypally female phenomenon. A 17th century print by Wenceslas Holler depicts women wagging their tongues in church, the marketplace, and the public baths. Other common insults included the charge of being drunk or a witch, and generic terms of reproach such as rogue and knave. There is scope for fuller investigation of what it meant to be called a dog in early modern England, but I don't have time, alas, to pursue that line of inquiry here, maybe in questions. The questions of morality and honour raised by these cases did not occur in a vacuum. They were not untouched by the ideological conflicts that swirled around them. Such insults were entangled with and coloured by religious assumptions. After the Reformation, the vulgar term whore became inflected with new connotations. It resonated with the stories of prostitutes and harlots in the Old and New Testament, and was shaped by a culture in which ritual denunciation of Catholicism as the whore of Babylon became a commonplace. Denunciation of the abuses of clerical celibacy was central to anti-popish polemic. Tales of the licentious liaisons in which monks engaged with loose women and the illegitimate bastards produced by such unions continued to be told in the 17th century. Defamation cases also occurred in an environment in which charges of sexual promiscuity were regularly propelled against other forms of sectarian dissent, especially antinomian sects like the Adamites and Quakers and Ranters. This was a revival of an ancient heresiological trope constructed around the clandestine, nocturnal behaviour of false believers. Allegations involving references to the pox and other forms of venereal disease drew on a repertoire of discourse that linked sick bodies and defiled souls. Quakers were frequently accused of sorcery and witchcraft, crimes that involved diabolical manipulations of speech in the form of cursing and spells. Antipathy towards members of the sect drew on the language of demonology. These different registers of insult increasingly overlapped. Derogatory religious epithets converged with other terms of abuse in ways that further destabilised their meaning. A case from early 17th century Oxfordshire was provoked by an argument between Richard Mercer and Alice Gulliver after some pigs trampled a cornfield. The pair exchanged insults which included both Puritan and whore, and in another suit in Leicestershire in 1668, a curate's wife taunted her opponent as a slut, jade, and Presbyterian dog. A decade later, an office case from the East Riding of Yorkshire involved the allegation that the gentleman John Fiddis had called the rector of Foxholes, Caleb Wilkinson, a damned, confounded dog, Presbyterian rascal, and main-sworn rogue, speaking these words in a very angry manner. Further evidence of the incorporation of these terms into contemporary discourse is provided by a nasty set of disputes that began in the summer of 1691, when Anne Milner publicly slandered Isabel Clough as a burnt-arse whore who had got the clap from Christopher Burrell. The situation escalated into an argument between Milner's husband and Clough's son-in-law, in the course of which the former called her a papishly whore. The insult was repeated by Elizabeth Clough in the streets of Aberford near Leeds, who said she was a papish or popish bitch and a papish or popish whore. In the presence of several of her neighbours and various strangers, various witnesses insisted that Anne Milner was a good Protestant and a frequenter of her parish church on Sundays to hear divine service and sermons, and that she also had received Holy Communion. They verily believed there was no reason to suspect her of being popishly affected. In this instance, the inflammatory language of anti-popery was used to prosecute an intra-Protestant dispute and to draw into question the morality and reputation of a married woman. The use of these terms adjectively suggests that confessional language was becoming normalised by the end of the 17th century. This is also evident from a case of murder involving an assault with a sword tried in the Old Bailey in 1685. The defendant, John Dee, was convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter on the grounds that he had received diverse blows with other provocations, including being taunted as a papist rogue, and that he drew his blade in defence of his own life. Verbal enmity and violence were inseparable twins. The comparative paucity of suits that turned directly on the use of confessional labels can be interpreted in two possible ways. On the one hand, the cases that reached the courts may be the tip of an iceberg of seething discontent. On the other, the rarity with which they were pursued suggests that many people found other means of healing the breaches of charity effected by contemptuous words. Exchanges that ended more amicably leave little imprint on the historical record. Lawyers themselves recognized that such words could be said in humour and jest without any intention to hurt. Mobilized to make a light-hearted joke, they may even have mitigated and eased latent conflict. Allegations of defamation were the alter ego of the act of reporting an offence. Bearing witness to the commission of a crime was a Christian responsibility. Common fame, that is gossip, suspicion and rumour, were legitimate grounds on which an individual could be prosecuted. Tale-bearing about one's dissenting neighbours and turning them into the authorities could be a form of charitable hatred itself, undertaken in the interests of the spiritual health of the community. Often, though, people chose not to take this step. They turned a blind eye and a deaf ear and ignored what they saw and heard. They adopted a strategy of silence that cannot easily be disentangled from sullen hostility or simple indifference, but which was itself a kind of conflict management and indeed of toleration. The last part of this lecture turns towards two forms of exchanging words that were designed to restore unity and achieve consensus. The first are the formal disputations that continued to be conducted in academic and institutional settings, extending a rhetorical tradition that had its roots in the medieval schools. Contemporaries remained convinced of the capacity of dialectical exchange to convince the doubtful and to convert those seduced by error. Debates between Catholics and Protestants, Puritans and conformists continued to be publicly staged in the wake of the Reformation. The celebrated contest between Martin Luther and Johannes Eck in Leipzig in 1519 had many counterparts in Tudor England, including the various Latin disputes on the subject of the Eucharist that took place in Oxford and Cambridge in 1549. These reflected a shared humanist heritage that placed faith in the capacity of reasoned discussion to resolve doctrinal disagreements and to bring about ecumenical concord. Such controversies were akin to ordeals, in that it was assumed that God would facilitate the victory of truth over falsehood. The eagerness of opposing parties to engage in oral duels was predicated on the assumption that words were invincible weapons in the hands, or rather the mouths, of the righteous. Correspondingly, refusal to participate was read as a sign of defeat. Disputation was understood as a charitable office to the souls of the hearers. One minister quoted the Italian scholar Giovanni Pico de Mirandola, who had described it as the sieve or circe to sever the fine flour of truth from the coarse bran of error. The problem was that both processes could backfire. By giving rival opinions the oxygen of publicity, this remedy for theological deviance might serve not to eradicate, but to spread the disease. The growing tendency to conduct disputations behind closed doors and in the presence of a limited audience reflects unease about the capacity of oral exchange to favour those who had mastered the art of rhetoric. The Tower of London was the scene of exchanges between Edmund Campion and the deans of St Paul's and Windsor, who had to combat rumours that they'd been outwitted by the erudite missionary, who, like some great bear or lion, had shaken us off like cowardly curs. They retorted that these were impudent lies. Similar entanglements took place in private settings in the 1620s against the backdrop of several high-profile aristocratic conversions to popery, notably that of the Countess of Buckingham, some of which resulted in further defections to Rome. These debates between learned clerics sit on a continuum with the conferences that ministers conducted with recusant parishioners. Conferring with those backward and corrupt in religion after a charitable sort was a pastoral obligation enshrined in an ecclesiastical canon of 1604. many thought it prudent to avoid aggressive language and to adopt a courteous stance towards Catholic nonconformists. In a tract of 1603, John Dove said that provoking papists to anger by bitter speeches was counterproductive. The more effective strategy was gentleness. However, moderate language could not be justified where it gave rise to the impression that some form of reconciliation between Catholicism and Protestantism was possible. Its permissibility as a mechanism for reclaiming the wayward did not extend to recognizing the status of Rome as a true, if flawed, church. Some godly Protestants saw peaceable conference as an attractive solution to the violent conflicts unleashed by vicious words and the penal laws. An anonymous epistle by a charitable brother calling for a milder course in matters of religion in 1605 not only invoked the parable of the wheat and the tares to argue against the use of the sword, it also warned of the dangers of indiscreet zeal and the inability of force to effect conversion. Engaging in conversation with the misguided would have greater benefits than stopping their mouths or coercing them with violence. In this text, cordial conferences on matters in dispute were a concomitant of toleration, but a toleration that was envisaged as an interim stage and a sweet way to come to unity. In the interim, people should live alongside each other in what he called moral amity. Arguments of this kind sowed the seeds for further calls for liberty of conscience in the 1640s. Such texts argued that free circulation of opinion in the forum of speech would extinguish error and permit the true religion to triumph. The civil wars and interregnum saw a resurgence of tongue combats between Orthodox Protestants and dissident sectarians. These reflected the emergence of a religious marketplace teeming with dissonant voices. Unlearned lay people and tub preachers presumed to take issue with educated clerics. The latter were reluctant to lend legitimacy to their upstart opinions by agreeing to dispute with them, but they also feared that refusing to do so would be interpreted as pusillanimous timidity. These disputations were also predicated on the precept that enlightenment would arise from honest debate. How many sparks of truth have been beaten out by the collision even of flints, asked Francis Fulwood in an account of his debate with a secretary in South Devon in 1656. 2 years later, the Presbyterian John Lay traced disputations back to the conflict between the Archangel Michael and Satan, contrasted them with the Catholic practice of burning heretics, and presented them as an antidote to the poison of falsehood. Military clashes might have ceased, but, he said, a great deal of word war continued. Lay urged the Orthodox to avoid contumelious speeches against their antagonists and embrace meekness of spirit. Indeed, fears of boisterous misbehaviour led to the cancellation of more than one disputation by the civil magistrates. Some subjects were off limits, and it was considered unlawful to dispute with a blasphemer or atheist. Lay's tract responded to a dispute between a Warwickshire minister and an unlettered pastor, which the latter had published. This text not only magnified Onley's performance, but made it seem as if Brian had suffered a failing of his faculties. Lay concluded that it would have been far better if his colleague had followed the advice of King Hezekiah and answered him not. It was inconsistent with peace and the common interest for private persons of this kind to toss to and fro as a ball betwixt two rackets in wrangling altercation. If some of the disputes that took place in churches, streets, marketplaces and private homes were full of uncharitable speeches and thunderbolts of impudency, others were apparently conducted in a loving and pious manner and ended with kind salutes. Such exchanges did not always disrupt social relations. The diary of the Presbyterian Lancashire apprentice Roger Lowe describes how he debated the controverted issue of episcopacy with an Anglican neighbour in an alehouse after the Restoration. When they met 3 days later, all anger was removed. On another occasion, he argued late into the night with a papist who began to speak revilingly of Luther and Calvin, to which Lowe responded robustly, while noting that we were in love and peace in our discourse. Polemical enmity against popery and Protestantism was not inconsistent with keeping on good terms with individual adherents of these rival faiths. The mutual exchanging of words on controverted topics could even be a means of releasing tension and heat. The written and printed texts in which formal disputes were fossilized for wider dissemination may be compared with didactic dialogues. As one scholar has observed, they are the controversial branches of a single family tree. Revived in the Renaissance, dialogues were another tried and tested pastoral device for resolving disagreements. In Erasmus's Colloquies, dialogue is both a metaphor and mechanism for achieving spiritual consensus. In Thomas More's Dialogue Concerning Heresies of 1529, it's a device for exorcising Lutheranism. Lively fictional exchanges were deployed by Protestants from the earliest days of the Reformation. Hans Sachs' A Godly Disputation between a Christian shoemaker and a popish parson, translated from German in 1548, involves a vigorous conversation during which the layman is branded a Lutheran and gospeler, and the priest is taunted as a hypocrite and Pharisee by his godlier social inferior. It concludes with the pair falling into violent diatribes against one another. The parson tells the shoemaker to get thee out of doors and come no more into my house, thou shamefaced beast, while the latter boasts that a mere cobbler has stopped the mouth of this shaveling. The better-known dialogues by the Elizabethan Puritans George Gifford and Arthur Dent may be read in the same light. Filtered through the lens of literary convention, such texts capture the idioms of everyday speech on religious issues ministers overhead coming from the mouths of their parishioners. Gifford's dialogue between a papist and a Protestant is a lengthy, angry dispute that ends in a stalemate, involving a critique of church papistry, an apocalyptic discourse about the papacy as the Antichrist, and an attack on the cult of the saints. This is an acerbic conversation in which the speakers exchange insults. Papist attacks his Protestant adversaries as newfangled rashheads, and in return, Protestant denounces Catholicism as a hodgepodge and dunghill of all gross heresies. In other dialogues, including Gifford's Country Divinity and Dent's Plain Man's Pathway, the interlocutors likewise resort to ridicule and invective. But at least one of the wayward characters is brought to a state of regeneration, often symbolically at the end of a long journey. These are intense but courteous conversations in which gifted teachers bring ungodly laymen to a deeper understanding of the Protestant faith. They also seek to wean these rustic Pelagians away from the view that all can be saved, which Stuart Swartz has seen as the soil in which popular tolerance grew. Agents of a charity that's consistent with ideological hatred, it's striking how often they dramatize debates about persecution and toleration themselves. They involve exchanges about whether rulers can compel the consciences of their subjects and whether coercion ever produces true faith. Two of the most celebrated statements in favour of toleration that emerged in the mid-17th century were constructed as dialogues. Roger Williams' The Bloody Tenet of Persecution, and Richard Overton's The Arraignment of Mr. Persecution. The Bloody Tenet is a conference between truth and peace, the central theme of which is the separation of church and state, and the repudiation of the authority of the magistrate to arbitrarily divide the seed of God from the weeds with which they are mixed. An indictment of enforced uniformity is the source of civil unrest and soul-destroying hypocrisy. It also argues that true civility in Christianity can flourish in kingdoms despite religious differences. Overton's Arraignment stages the trial of Mr. Persecution for various crimes, including treason, rebellion, and bloodshed. The cast of characters includes Mr. God's vengeance, Good Samaritan, politique power, civil government, and domestic miseries. Historians have dwelt on the compelling ideas these tracts contain at the expense of their form. Such books mirrored the real conversations engendered by England's wars of words and of religion. Confessional boundaries and sectarian identities were hardening, but as a vehicle for the religious debates in which contemporaries engaged in a range of settings and spaces, the dialogue retained its vitality. Gilbert Coles's dialogue between a Protestant and a Papist of 1679, published at the time of the Popish plot and exclusion crisis, debates prayer in an unknown tongue, communion in one kind, the worship of images, and the invocation of saints. The interlocutors are Theophilus, a true son of the Church of England, and Philodoxus, who has fallen to the Church of Rome. The dialogue ends on a conciliatory note, with Theophilus begging Philodoxus' pardon for his incivility and for forgetting the respect due to a worthy neighbour and friend, who has graciously made him a visit. He hopes that he will be so kind as to stay longer and give him the opportunity to make amends. Cole's book reflected his conviction that a Puritan faction had wrought a schism, disturbing the peace of the church and state, approving themselves better skilled at their weapons than their arguments, and instead of writing against their adversaries, writing against their friends. It was a call for reconciliation with dissenters in the interests of reuniting the realm. It's tempting to suggest that the tone of this text reflects wider shifts in sensibility within the Protestant mainstream that paved the way for the legislation of 1689, which finally acknowledged that some religious dissent had to be accommodated because it could not be eliminated. It's to these and other developments in the intersecting spheres of religion and communication that I turn in the final lecture in this series tomorrow. I close this one with the observation that the multiple ways in which contemporaries exchanged words, from denigrating nicknames and defamatory allegations to public disputations and private conversations, were critical agents in shaping interconfessional relationships and in their transformation over time. Thank you.